Resilience, vulnerability, well-being. There isn't an organisation out there who aren't aware of the importance of these attributes. But how easy is it to make them a part of workplace culture? I'm joined today by Alex Staniforth, the founder of mental health charity Mind Over Mountains, to discuss this. Alex is a record-breaking adventurer, author and ultra runner. He's committed to helping others build resilience through adventure, born from his experiences of having survived two of the biggest disasters in Mount Everest history as a teenager, and through his personal challenges, including suffering with epilepsy, stammering, bullying, and mental health since childhood. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Dan. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to move into our straight into our first question, which we're asking all of our guests on this series, which is to invite you to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Okay, well, where to start? While still sounding while still sounding modest. So yeah, I would describe myself as an adventurer, an ultra runner, an author, a motivational speaker, and the founder of a mental health charity. Essentially, I my main effort now is around using my own challenges and experiences to help other people overcome their challenges, to take advantage of adversity, and to leave something bigger behind. Um, Through speaking, through storytelling, and through the outdoor challenges I do. I was born in Chester. I've been in Kendal for about 4 years. 27, so I guess still fairly young, and trying to cling on to that for as long as possible. But ultimately, it's about for me, life is about challenges, and that's what makes life meaningful for me.
And I'm curious about, in our intro, we talked about vulnerability, and it's not a word that we would usually associate with the world of extreme adventure and high performance. Yet it is something that you and a lot of companies are talking about more nowadays. And so, I'm curious to hear your take on vulnerability. Why do you think it's such a critical skill for leaders to have?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't really class myself as a leader in a conventional way. So that's a bit of vulnerability right there. Um, Adventure and high performance, these things aren't seen as, they are seen as the pinnacle of strength and achievement, and ultimately, when you think of running an ultra marathon or climbing Everest or doing these things, you see that kind of pinnacle of strength. And I think that's why it's so important to really break that kind of stereotype and that image and actually show the human side and show that we have the same fears, doubts, and worries, as everybody else. We just deal with them in a different way. And as you mentioned, the intro about having a stammer, badly bullied, my own mental health challenges. It's really important people see that because I don't want them to think, well, I couldn't do that because of this. Actually, we can do so much. Um, and I think it's important in businesses, and again, just a kind of caveat that I don't come from a standard business background. It's around, it's showing up as our true selves. It's exposing things, parts of ourselves that maybe we don't want to share, that we just want to kind of keep in a box over there in the corner. Um, and I think what I've seen personally with that is it helps other people feel safe to do the same, to really show up
Mm,
as themselves and to bring all their skills, to be willing to take risks, to make mistakes. And I often call it, the positive multiplier effect, because it actually leads into how the charity started about 5 or 6 years ago, when I started talking about my own, mental health challenges in public for the first time. Something that I'd always been too ashamed of talking about because I was this adventurer. I was, this athlete. I was this person who was supposed to be mentally tough, and
mm,
kind of invulnerable. Um, And when I did finally find the courage to talk about that, I just posted it in a blog for the world to see. The most terrifying thing I'd ever done. Um, the response was amazing because actually other people then started saying, "Oh, well, I thought I was the only one," and then they start talking about it, and then you get this effect where people um, create a safe space to really, talk about the things that are challenging them. And as a result of that blog, I then did a challenge called Climb the UK, which involved climbing to the highest points of all the counties in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, about 5,000 miles in 72 days. Essentially, just to take that message out there, to show that actually having mental ill health isn't a weakness. It's okay to be vulnerable. Um, and since then, it's kind of got easier and easier to talk about it, to the point that actually now I often worry about kind of oversharing. Where do you kind of find that kind of boundary between saying too much? But as a result of that challenge, I was then invited to lead an event in the Lake District, which is all around trying to promote the benefits of walking for mental health. And ultimately, that one event became a pilot for actually for Mind Over Mountains, which is been a mental health charity since August 2020. And just that one moment of vulnerability, that courage, has ultimately created something much much bigger. Um,
Mm.
and I think as leaders, we need to be willing to put our hand up first, to set that example, to create the safety for other people. And obviously, the benefits of that are huge, in building trust, in people being able to build relationships and to innovate, I guess.
And I'm keen to learn more about how you've kind of used this experience, particularly your experience with um, going to Mount Everest when you were a teenager. It's not the norm for most teenagers, but you definitely you definitely chose to take the courageous path rather than a comfortable one. And then I'm curious to hear about more of the two biggest disasters in that in the history, and that to us seems a bit unimaginable. What kind of impact did those experiences have on your sort of leadership style, that you've and the attribute that and the attributes that you now value in leaders?
Great question. I think, firstly, for context, I went to Everest for the first time in 2014 when I was 18. That was after 4 years of training, prep, fundraising. Just getting
Mm,
to the mountain is actually the hardest part of that whole process. The actual mountain is supposedly fairly straightforward. Um, and before we got to base camp, there was a massive avalanche which sadly killed 16 Sherpas in the icefall. So we had to pack up and go home without stepping
mm.
a single foot on the mountain. Went back the following year at 19, and this time we were just below Camp 1. We'd moved through the icefall when the earthquake hit Nepal. So suddenly we're at 6,000 meters altitude, being hit by this big blast of powder. And for the first time in my life at 19, thinking, this is it. We were trapped up there for 2 days, not realizing that actually we'd just been a tiny part in this global disaster that had taken over 9,000 lives, including three of our Sherpas down at base camp.
Wow.
And inadvertently got caught up in the two biggest disasters in Everest history. Over 20 people died at base camp that day, and had we not left base camp, then the odds are that we probably wouldn't be having this chat today. Um, so that's what happened, and you know what do you learn from that as a leader? I think the importance of risk and opportunities. You know, People think that staying at base camp is the safest place to be. That's
Mm.
our comfort zone. When in reality, staying at base camp, staying in our comfort zone probably would have killed us. Our tents were buried under a foot of ice, snow, and rock. And it was literally one decision to go up that day, to go through the ice fall, which is the most dangerous part of the route. Um, a matter of 5 hours is what made the difference. And when you see the amount of devastation and destruction that thing causes, you really come back kind of thinking, you know, had I been in that tent at base camp, what would I have left behind? And ultimately, 19, having a midlife crisis, thinking, what's this all about? Um, and you realize what's really important, that we're all on borrowed time. And
Mm.
me now, being a leader is about leaving something bigger behind. Whether that's education or mental health or sustainability, whatever it is that you're passionate about. It's using that and bringing people together to make a difference. And I guess that's been the focus since Everest. I'm still doing challenges, but the why is different. It's about helping people to believe in themselves, that together we can achieve something and to make a difference. So I think that's what's been driving me more, is it's the leaders that are using that to do genuinely good things.
I mean, yeah, such an extreme example, but in a way, kind of a really great analogy for what we can do, what we can achieve out of our comfort zone, and
Mm.
how important being out of our comfort zone is. Um, Showing yourself and being vulnerable with others. will ultimately does take courage, but also should more of us make should we make it more relatable and trustworthy? We've done some research with over 500 global CEOs and senior executives, and the number one driver of people engagement and retention is trust. What what advice would you give to leaders who are trying or struggling to build a culture of trust?
Great question. I think it comes back to that vulnerability piece, as you say. You've got to be willing to take ownership of your mistakes and failures, and put your hand up, and
Mm,
um, and show up as yourselves. And I think that's what sets the example for other people to do the same. And ultimately, two failures at Everest are the reason we're having this call today. That was just the start. That was just one opportunity, one silver lining in this whole journey. Um, and I think to get trust, you have to give trust. And
mm,
what I've noticed in the charity team, I mean, we're a very, very small team, is kind of handing things over, being willing to kind of give people ownership of the outcome, to be able to trust them to do things has been really hard for me, because I've always been very much an independent kind of one man army with most of
mm,
my projects. Not to say I've not had a great team around me, but in my business, in my speaking, for example, I've always just done it my own way.
mm,
Um, and so that was a great learning experience. And you know, when you get to the point when you can't manage everything, you possibly can't do everything, it's not sustainable. That's a great sign of growth of the charity, but also it's a very important thing to learn. And you've got to give people that ownership of the outcome. And when our CEO joined the charity about 2.5 months ago, Ian is great, he's fantastic. And it's the hard part for me is almost handing over my baby, that I started, and having trust in the people around me, and knowing that they will make mistakes just like I do. Um, but I think yeah, that's it's about accepting that we can't possibly do everything. And when I did accept that, I stopped burning myself out in the process. But to give one example on Everest, again, another extreme example, but hopefully people can relate, is just after the earthquake, when we were trapped in our tents for 2 days. We had no idea what was going to happen. I mean, we,
mm,
we were told we could be there for a week. We've got food for a day or 2 days at most. The route down to base camp was gone. Every half an hour, we've got aftershocks and avalanches hitting us on both sides. And yet, all we could do is just sit there waiting like ducks in a pond. All we could control was staying hydrated, was staying fueled, and looking after each other.
mm,
Uh, and Tim, our leader, I'll never forget, he kind of popped his head through the tent that night and just very calmly and very softly said, "Right, chaps, keep the stoves on, keep the brews going, take it easy, just, you know, keep your heads down. We'll just have to sit tight and see how it goes." And I could kind of see the fear and the anxiety in his face. And obviously, don't kind of quote me. I'm not sure exactly what he said. I had probably bigger things going on in my head at the time. Um, but it was that not knowing all the answers,
mm.
being willing to actually admit that, not trying to pretend, not wearing a mask, I think was key. And by that, being vulnerable, being human, I think we could trust them so much more. Um,
Yeah.
I think authenticity is key. People have that sixth sense around that, and it's hard to trust people if you don't quite know what their motives are. Um, so yeah, hopefully there's a few things there.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's the having that because that, I mean, obviously him coming in and having that, despite the fact that you couldn't quote word for word, it's still an absolutely memorable experience. Like, and you saw something in that yeah, he was trying his best to tell you to kind of chill out in one of the most extreme circumstances you'd probably ever find yourself in, but at the same time just gave you some comfort with that kind of normal, yep, put the kettle on. I'm sure we'll be fine. That kind of optimism, well, I'm sure will have provided some comfort, um, and ultimately trust. So my next question is about potential, and how do you think leaders can create environments that inspire people and help them achieve their full potential?
Again, great question on the spot. I think, again, in our context with the charity team, I don't see myself as the kind of authority figure. I've always been keen to kind of push the team into the limelight and just kind of I've never really had the confidence to kind of step up and be the spokesperson, whereas they try and push me into that role.
Mm,
Um, so from what I have experienced, is inspiration is about emotion, and to get that, you have to be able to share emotion ourselves, to be really passionate about something. Um, and I think ultimately it is about having, having that kind of end vision in sight, keeping that regular and consistent and reminding people, of where we're going and making it relate to them. I think again, they've got to have some say in that. They've got to have some contribution to the outcome. And in the charity again, because there's only a small team of us. We all work very, very closely and just been doing some work on the strategy and the plan for the year, and it's getting everyone's input in that. And one of the first things Ian did the charity he started is he organised a meeting with all the team and basically just to get their feedback, to get their
mm,
input, so actually they feel like that they're being heard. Um, and I think that's what inspires people, is that kind of that contribution approach. Um, And again, I think it comes down to storytelling. And one of my biggest inspirations has been a friend of mine, Jeff Smith, who runs a charity called Big Moose. And I don't quite know how he does it, but they've just got their purpose, their mission really clear, and they they're really good at telling the story. They're not too shy about putting it out there, having a go. They're not really saying, oh, look at us doing this. It's more a case of, this is really cool. Do you want to come and join us? And I've been to their events, they're just sold out. They just have this movement that everybody wants to be part of it. And
mm,
and yeah, I've always used that as my kind of end goal, is how can you get everybody engaged? And it's about having that clear and compelling purpose that excites people. And ultimately with the charity, mental health is something that relates, relates and connects and affects all of us. That it's not a hard sell. A lot of people want to be involved, and as a leader, I think my challenge has been to be confident to step up and be that spokesperson.
mm.
Um, you know, so ultimately though, I think being the underdog, being that kind of shy and more, introverted self, I think sometimes people can connect with that a lot more. So yeah, I think it's all about emotion and getting people to really give their hearts to that.
And you mentioned purpose there, and I'm curious to know if there is there anything specifically that you do to help keep your organization aligned with those core values that you have?
We could definitely do more. I mean, our purpose is restore mental health through outdoor experiences, and we believe that everybody should have access to the tools that they need to stay mentally and physically well. That's our charity mission statement. Our values are heartfelt, empowering, courageous, and determined. And I'm quite proud to remember them. I'm not sure everybody would. Um, Ultimately, though, there's always a fine balance between having that kind of above the door and then actually getting on and doing the work.
Yeah.
And the classic thing, you get so busy that sometimes you forget to kind of check in with those, and they're kind of shoved on a word doc. They're kind of put on a word document somewhere and not seen for years. Um, so I think with us, those values were chosen because they just naturally link so well to what we do, so we don't have to try too hard. One thing I've noticed is, as a team, sometimes our behaviors don't necessarily align to that. And we've had to say, hang on a minute, we are talking about this, we're doing this in public, or why aren't we doing this ourselves, behind kind of closed doors? I'm
Mm,
sure every business, especially much bigger ones, have been through the same thing. Um, I think when you have that clear purpose, it takes time. And that's the challenge, is a lot of people don't have time to spend on it. Um, Again, everybody has to contribute, which is easier for us because there's not many of us. And also, when you have that purpose, I think it's so easy to kind of, to use it as a filter, because as a wellbeing charity, there is so much we could do, and we could do a bit of everything, here, there, and everywhere.
mm,
Um, but having that is what allows us to filter out what we should and what we shouldn't do. Inevitably, there's some things that we don't get involved with because they don't really, especially as a wellbeing charity, we have to be selective. And there's lots of people doing great things in the outdoor space and the mental health space. And we have our own approach to that. We have our own niche. And sometimes I say, actually, that's not for us. That's not us. And I think having those clear values and understanding what they actually mean is what becomes that filter, because inevitably, things are always going to go wrong. We're not always going to help everybody as much as we like. We're not always going to be the right fit. But as our co-founder always used to say, Chris always used to say, "Are we doing great work?" And we're not always going to get it right, but at the end of the day, if we're making a difference, if we're doing great work, then I think that's all that really matters.
Yeah. And that's a really good question to constantly ask yourselves, I guess. And I suppose I might throw that back at you. What is the greatest thing you're doing as a leader right now?
Blimey. Well, again, just coming back to the kind of imposter feeling of not really being a leader, but it depends how you define it. For me, it's about
Yeah.
helping people believe in themselves, and the most interesting thing right now as a leader has actually been, I think I mentioned before, has been handing over to our CEO, and that for me is a great step for the charity. And
Yeah.
that will allow us to reach a whole new level. I admittedly, and again on the vulnerability piece, I realized towards the end of 2021 that the charity was getting too big and too busy, and trying to manage that alongside my own work and my own challenges and adventures was a real challenge of boundaries. And I started to really burn myself out, which as a mental health charity is obviously not a great example to set. So it was a case of being able to focus on my strengths, not the things I'm not good at, and actually as much as it was difficult to kind of let go, it was actually the right thing for the charity to grow and sustain and to reach our potential and reach more people,
Mm,
was to put my hand up and say, we need some help. And our board of, our team trustees were amazing. And actually, they've always said that as a founder, especially in this kind of early startup stage, if we don't look after our own energy, if we don't look after ourselves, then the charity can kind of go down too. And that wasn't an option. So I'm really enjoying this kind of transition period. It's challenging in a good way, and that will allow me to sort of focus more on being a spokesperson. Doing daft challenges for us to raise money, and doing the things where I can make my biggest difference. So that's probably been the biggest thing at the moment.
mhm.
Um, is still being involved, but actually focusing on strengths. And I've started mentoring somebody myself recently, which is really nice to be able to pay that forward. So yeah, definitely don't have a clue what I'm doing, but just trying to pass on what I've learned, I guess.
And it's interesting because I often go through these things of like, you don't know how you might be able to help people, but they make that decision for themselves, don't they?
Yeah.
I'm curious if is there I suppose we've talked about the Everest and the influences that's had on your leadership, whether you would define yourself as a leader or not. Um, which again is for I suppose in some ways for other people to decide. But what else would you say has made the biggest difference to your leadership so far?
Um, what's made the biggest difference? I think it's ultimately about having great people around me, having mentors myself from an early age. Chris, so he was my first mentor and coach when I was 16 before Everest. And ultimately, what started as a mentoring kind of, a mentoring relationship became a friendship and then a partnership. It started in the charity 3 years ago. I think that's a great transition. That's a great journey to go on.
Mm,
And um, I think it can be a very kind of isolating place. There's not many people in that space, and the ones that you want to ask for help and advice are often the people that you don't want to show that level of kind of insecurity, or make yourself actually vulnerable. So it's almost you end up with not really having anybody to ask. So having mentors that have been there, that have done that have achieved great things, I think that has absolutely accelerated the whole process.
mm,
And I still work with a lot of those now. That relationship has kind of changed. And you have to keep growing that circle, finding people that have been where you want to be, and learning from them. Um, but I'd say ultimately it is about the people you have around you and how life changing that can be. Hearing the right thing at the right time, and also being open and being curious about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that though who you surround yourself with, can really influence and shape you as a person, can't it? So, my final question is the same question that we ask everyone, which is: if you were starting your career again, what would be the best piece of advice you would give yourself?
Oh God. Um, Maybe don't climb Everest. No, not really. 'Cause honestly, Everest has given me so much more, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
really grateful for that. And it's just I thought Everest was the end goal, but I realise now that it's just the start, and
Mm,
that's exciting. And the challenge is how do I kind of surpass that? Um, I think what I'd say to myself is, and it may sound counterintuitive, but always think bigger, and also don't get complacent or get too comfortable, because I think ultimately, um, you get to where you get to a you get to kind of a great place, and you get kind of comfortable, and sometimes you let your eye off the ball, you assume things are a given, and then something comes out of the blue, and knocks you right off, and
mm,
not getting complacent or taking things as granted, definitely. With the aiming bigger thing, I think it's around challenges, and a lot of things I've done in the last sort of 10 years. I've often tried to wing it. I've often liked that kind of underdog approach. I've often not had the resources, and often I've just not had the creativity or the opportunity to really think, right, how big can I make this? And I think there's just so many opportunities with challenges, with speaking, with fundraising, when I could have made a much bigger thing of it and raised a lot more money, and it could have taken me to a new place. And I think
mm.
with fundraising in particular, my goal is to raise £1 million in my lifetime. And I think, considering what I've done and the pain I've put myself through, I should be a lot closer to that now. Um, and I think sometimes I've often felt that I just didn't give it my all. I just kind of thought I just get the job done, get the challenge done, everything else is the bonus. Whereas if you've got the right people around you, if I've been willing to maybe ask for help a bit sooner, and also not trying to do too many things at once, I could have
Mm.
really, absolutely nailed those things. Um, so that's the advice I give myself. And I think the main thing I've learned is around, trusting the process, and knowing that whatever goes wrong, there's always an opportunity. There's always a silver lining, even if you can't see it at the time.
Well, I think that's really great advice, and hopefully by you being joining us today, we can hopefully reach some more people and help you with your fundraising goal of £1 million in your lifetime. So, Alex, thank you very much for joining us today. And that just leaves me to say, if you want to find out any more about Mind Over Mountains, or connect with Alex or myself, or even find out more about Impact, you can find all the links you need in the description below. So that just remains me to say thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you.